Hi, everyone. Welcome to A Word with Kelly Scott Reed. I'm here today with Jared Beloff. Jared is a poet, a teacher, and the peer reviewer for the Whale Road Review. Whale Road Review. Railroad Review. No, Whale Road Review. His manuscript of poems will be published in 2023. Who Will Cradle Your Head is the title. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jared.
Thanks for having me.
Sorry about the mutilation of the title. I told you I get tongue twisted. I warned you. I warned you ahead of time.
Totally fine.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself that I didn't already explain. Anything you're working on, anything going on with you?
So working on it actually, so since I got the news that the manuscript got picked up, I have been in a bit of a drought of kind of figuring out what are my next steps and kind of tying up loose ends with that. And I have a couple ideas, but they haven't really gelled into full out writing yet. I've been working on trying to create a micro chaplet of poems about New England poets that are obsessed with Dunkin' Donuts, whether they were or not. I have a few that have been published. One was about Elizabeth Bishop dreaming of moose while she's waiting in the drive-through, and another one with Mary Oliver in Wellfleet picking out a cruller to eat. So
That was such a good one. I actually looked at, I'm a Mary Oliver fan. I
yeah,
read her aloud in almost all my yoga classes. I just think she's very in touch with kind of like the spiritual and the internal mechanisms of being human. And I read that one on your website. I thought it was great. Yeah,
thank
that's
you.
a very cool concept. I love it.
Yeah, so
Have
I'm
you,
just, what's that?
I was just going to say, have you tried, do you write exclusively poetry or do you do some short story or fiction?
I've written some short stories, mostly when I was younger. I had actually one. So I went to the Susquehanna University Writers Workshop when I was in high school. It was like a summer camp type of thing, and I was there for fiction and wrote short stories. And one of them was unfinished. It was like this concept of, it's in Pennsylvania. I was driving from my grandparents lived in the Poconos up to the university, and there was a sinkhole in this small town. And I was like, what is that? And my grandmother um, made me, she gave me a short history of like some of the old mines like cave in. And then she told me about Centralia, which is still on fire underground. Like you can't live there. There's smoke coming out of the tar and cracks of this small town in Pennsylvania. And so my idea was like to kind of take A Rose for Emily, um, which is about a small town in Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha, and rewrite it with a mining town where a house just completely goes down into a pit. And I left that, like, didn't know where to take it. And 20 something years later, I turned it into a flash that got published this year. So that's my only published fiction, but 25 years in the making.
That's great. Oh, wow. That's great. Where's it published so I can look for it?
It's at Janus Literary, and it has nothing to do with mining towns anymore. It's literally just takes the concept actually came. Somebody was saying like, who can write a good haunted house story? It was around October, and I was like, what if I wrote it not as a haunted house where you go into, but a house that haunts you, like it follows you around. And so I kind of thought about a disembodied house, like somebody who just can't get away from the thing that they've lost. And so this house
Hmm.
that has disappeared into the pit is now reappearing in bits and pieces for this woman. It's kind of an abstract, symbolic grief type situation, but it's I was happy with where it went, and it was totally not what I was trying to do 25 years ago.
Well, that sounds gorgeous. I really think that's beautiful. A house that haunts you. It's really beautiful. I'm sorry. I love that kind of thing. I actually have a house that haunts me. The more I think about it, I moved out of a house many, many years ago. It feels like I was still there. I'm still there. Loved it. Like I was completely
Yeah,
engrossed in it. And like I bring it with me everywhere I go. It's very
it's
interesting.
interesting, like we have these places that we inhabit, and that time when you're away on vacation or you're away somewhere, and you come back and you hit like there's some line, some invisible line that you cross, and you're like, okay, now I'm home. You recognize the skyline, you recognize something, and the tone of the sky is just right, or something that just like you realize, okay, I'm in that zone of where I used to inhabit. And so it's like we have these places that we've become so accustomed to, and I think if you stay around with one long enough, it can follow you and be a part of you.
Beautiful. So, when, or actually, could you describe a time in your life when you realized that language had power?
I feel like it's going to be cheesy, but high school English class was really, it had a very powerful effect on me. I had great teachers. I was not a reader in middle school. They kind of had to they had this thing where they forced you to read a certain
Mhm.
number of pages. So I was just like, all right, fine, I'm going to get this over with quickly, and picked like three really large novels. For some reason, I thought that was the right way to go. Big books. So I read The Hobbit, and I read some other books that were really large on the list, and that got me into reading a little bit. But when I got to high school, I had teachers that were, teaching the classics. I read 1984, and I remember that this distinctly. I got to the end, and I was so dissatisfied with the ending. And I turned to my teacher and I said, I hate this book. And she said, why? And just thinking about what made, I was like, oh, he intended for me to hate this thing. It was like this light bulb of like, oh, he was doing this for a reason. Okay. And, I probably should have picked that up earlier, but it was one of those, young reader moments where the power of executing something that I kind of intuitively understood craft in that moment. It was like, okay, I intended this thing to happen, and a reader has, you know, 40, 50 years later picked it up, right? So
Mhm.
um, I think that was powerful, and that's something that I'm an English teacher now, and I try to instill that. But I've always been kind of interested in the ways that language can take you out of what you're thinking and place you in somewhere else. And I don't mean that in like in a sort of escapist way. I mean that in like the way something is described can fully reorient your way of understanding that thing. And I love when poems do that, especially. But I love when a good novel can just kind of wake you up to a character or a thought in a way that you just weren't able to do on your own.
It's so interesting you say that about awakening something in you. Like you're talking about Orwell. I read Rumi a lot for my yoga prep. Like I do the poem. That's so old. It's like what, 1400s, 1300s, but the translations translate to these concepts. You're like, how could he understand this now? And just to kind of communicate directly with the reader from way back. Now, mind you, it's translated. So I'm sure there's some modern elements to the people who translate it, but it really there is a power to how these things land and how they come into you as a first time reader and communicate. Someone like you said, 50 years later or however long later can communicate with a person in high school. Like it's set a point to someone in high school. I just think it's kind of incredible.
Yeah, I mean, in both a yoga practice or in high school, if you're in the right mindset, it is about being receptive to that, open to that, looking for that. Sometimes it's a surprise, like I wasn't expecting that when reading it. In fact, was having the opposite until the teacher kind of just shifted me a little bit. But I think if you're coming in, I think that's the fun of being a teacher, being a student in the classroom is you're not sure where it's going to take you. I've been teaching the same novels for years, and I don't get tired of them because I have this whole new set of students that are having those experiences and making me think about it through their lens. And each year that like they'll tack on to some detail or some new thing, and it takes me in a different place. I always have my schema that I'm placing on it, like, okay, we're going to talk about the sublime right now in Frankenstein, but they're going to go, but I was thinking about this thing that happened here. Can we go to that page? And that, takes us into another realm, which is great.
Do you ever get like envious of your students reading things for the first time?
Yeah. I mean, I'll teach something over and over again, but I rarely read for enjoyment a second time. I have a pretty good memory, and so it's hard to enjoy it in the same way, if especially if that you have that expectation. When I teach, and if I'm doing it for research or something like that, the language will inspire me in some way, and I get something out of it. But if I'm reading it for plot, I have a hard time rereading it. So I envy the plot reader for the first time. But I think like when I'm reading for beauty, like I'll read anything by Toni Morrison at any time, and it'll be fantastic because her writing is just so superb. Like it doesn't matter if I'm reading the whole thing or if I open to a random page, you can recognize what is masterful about it. But I do envy the reader who is thinking about a concept that I enjoyed the first time and thinking about it and having that light bulb. So now it's more like I get this vicarious thrill from it, from watching them have it for the first time.
With that, what do you feel are the elements of good writing?
I don't know if there's a prescription for it. I think there's intention and there's execution of that intention, right? So it's like you could read, there are various things that we're reading at any given time, and then they're so different, and then they could both be good in the sense that they're achieving what they've set out to do in a way that is evoking something beyond both that intention and what the expectation is. And what I'm talking about there is like a interplay between the reader and the writer. I think that's the completion of the writing, is somebody actually receiving it, processing it, thinking about it in a way that the writer may not have even intended. I mean, I've had that happen with my own work. I'll have one of my friends read a poem as I'm writing it, and they'll make an observation. One of them made an observation about a poem, and it was a personal one, and I hadn't thought about it. The thing that they mentioned, it was kind of shocking to hear it because it was about me, and they're like, "This is what you've been wanting, and this is how it manifests in the poem." And I was like, I did not recognize this in myself, but I put it out there. So I think that interplay is a really interesting and important thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, does writing exhaust or exhilarate you?
I think when it's working for me, it's exhilarating and time doesn't matter. And like I just finished last month. I was working on a newer project, a chapbook of more narrative poems about a Jewish shtetl in Europe, and it has characters and there's a story. It actually has a plot, which I don't typically do in my poetry. And I kind of worked on it obsessively for 3 weeks and just wrote this whole thing. And I did that so quickly because I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. It was writing itself almost. And it was like each day I'd wake up and I'd have some new, oh, this character's going to do this thing. Let me write it. I think it gets exhausting when you're just not in a mind space for it. And I've learned, when I first started writing a few years ago, I was like, you got to write every day because that's what people say, right? And then I came to realize, no, I don't need to do that. I need to listen to what I need. And so I've learned to realize, like, if I'm forcing it and it feels arduous or it feels like it isn't working, don't just keep at it in that way. Like, either take a break, walk around, figure something out, or I'll just be like, okay, it's not time to do it. I'll go read. because I think, I've read people say, or I've heard people say, like, reading is writing, thinking is writing, walking around and observing is writing. And so if it is exhausting, I just leave and do something else. But it comes back because it's like I'm not turning it off. It's just moving around in the back of my mind. And then a couple days later, I'll come at it again and be like, oh, that's changed these things around that I started with. And that makes the poem have a better start. And then I can just kind of flows after that.
So when I was younger, I got overwhelmed quite often with tasks and stuff like that, and ADHD and that stuff. And my mom used to tell me, it's an old expression, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Like it was always compartmentalized. She would say, all right, you're being overwhelmed by the math homework. Put it down. Let's move on to something else and then go back to it. And, I remember, it's hard to put like what you're saying into practice, especially in real life when you're like, there's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
I look on social media and I watch people and I submit it again and again. And I'm like, no, I can't even find my glasses. That's an inside joke with the ladies. So it's like, I love that you're saying that because I think it really is the way I think a lot of folks have operate. Like we have to just put it down, walk away, come back, no forcing. I preach it for yoga, back off, do less when it starts to feel too intense. But practice is a whole different thing. Preaching is a lot easier to do
Yeah.
for me.
Writing is so weird because people are like, the success model is doing it a lot, submitting a lot, getting published a lot, right? And there's a drive to that. There's an obsessive quality to that kind of, I think I got to a point where I was like, when I first started, I was like, I have to do it. I have to keep doing it. I have to keep submitting everywhere. And then I started to just kind of, it took me a while to figure out how to build a collection and form it. It's a different mindset, different way of thinking than just writing a single poem or something that, I observed this thing, I'm going to write about this. And once I kind of got a handle on that, my mind set around submitting and working changed. It was like, okay, I'm dealing with an elephant, right? I'm dealing with it one bite at a time rather than I'm dealing with, I have to keep at it. And so the same thing happened with submissions. I'm not doing them as much because it's just, one, I'm not writing as much as I was. I finished that chapbook and I was like, I'm done for a little bit. And I also didn't want to submit everything. I kind of wanted to be a totality instead of, all these one-offs. And so it's not as important to get everything out that I have to get it published there are people that are like, I need to publish every day or I'm not feeling it. And I think that's a product of something else that's going on in the way we think about writing. And I was in that mindset. And then I think it just took, the longer I'm in it, the less I feel that way, at least right now.
So what inspired you to start writing in the first place? Like what was you obviously made a life of the written word and teaching and
Yeah.
passing it on.
I took a long hiatus of writing. I thought I wanted to write a lot in college. I was part of the literary magazine at Rutgers. I was editor there for a year. And then I went to grad school and then into public education. I wasn't writing at all. I was just doing like academic work and learning how to teach and teaching. And then I had kids and just didn't even, it was like if something really struck me or I was teaching a poetry unit, maybe I'd write something, but I didn't really think of it as a practice. And so pandemic hit, I couldn't focus, couldn't even read novels like I normally would. And I picked up some poetry. I think the Dodge Poetry Festival had a thing for teachers where they're like, here's a packet of poems. We're going to give you some prompts, write some poems. It was very low stakes. And I just started doing it. And it was more of a meditative practice where it's just like, go for a walk and observe 5 things, come back and write something. don't think too hard about it. And I would do that. And this was in the height of the pandemic here in New York, sirens all the time. So it was kind of like I was trying to find something to get my mind off of how crazy things were here. Um, and then it kind of, after that packet and meditative practice ended and there weren't prompts every day, I was like, well, maybe I'll just keep trying. And I was, and then I was like, I really like this. And I took a couple workshops, and from the workshops, it started to click, and I started to understand craft a little bit more, and was, reading more and more poetry to try to figure out what are other writers doing. And then it just became habit and task, and it started to pick up more and more. That kind of hit me. I mean, the other longer version of the story is, when I was in high school, my grandmother was like one of my readers. I'd send her everything, send her all my stories and poems. And she, she passed away 3 years ago, and they gave me like a binder that she had of everything. It's like she printed out all the emails and she put them in a
Oh,
binder. So I found all
that's
that.
awesome. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
she was really the best. She was super creative. She was like, didn't she got her GED when she was in her 60s, and always creative. She took art classes at community college in her 60s, and when she'd take care of us, it was like being in a classroom. She would have been a fantastic kindergarten teacher. I think it's probably why I'm a teacher, is just kind of taking that osmotically from her. And anyway, towards the end of her life, she'd always ask me, like, why aren't you writing? Are you writing? I used to love your stories. Why aren't you writing? And then, with everything that was going on, it was kind of like this carpe diem, like, what do you want in your life? And I was like, and that question came up, and I'm like, why am I not writing? I should write. And that Dodge Poetry Festival, the sirens, thinking about my grandma, all those things kind of coincided, and lit a flame, and here we are.
That's amazing. I love that you had that when you were younger. It's so important to have. Well, I have grandmothers in particular who my grandmother's still alive. It's kind of funny because I'm so old and she's almost 100. So, and
That's amazing.
my other grandmother died at 101, but they
Wow.
were also very influential in my uh, creative paths in life. It's so great to have that encouragement, that little buffer away from the parent. And I know I always say this, it's not because you don't love your parent, but there's like a no judgment thing going on with grandparents. Like there is no judgment. Like your grandparents love you, even when you're bratty, even when you're misbehaving. So there's a freedom to how honest you can be with them that I think that's what I've found.
Yeah, I mean, I have to give props to my parents too. They didn't have the same like interest or creativity, but they certainly pushed it, right? So like those camps that I went to, that I wrote that story, I wouldn't have gone there if I think my parents found out about it and were like, this is good for him, let's do it. And I don't know how much it cost back then, but they did it and they paid for it. They took me there. So I have to appreciate how much they saw, they saw something and in me and what I wanted to do, and said, that's worth investing in.
That's awesome. So, who are your literary heroes? So you have books that you use for your students
Yeah.
when you're teaching. Are any of those like ones that were favorites of yours or
Um, yeah, I mean, some of it's curriculum driven by like, here's the AP curriculum, here's the canon, here's and I choose from within that. But I wouldn't say those are my. I mean, Mary Shelley really is amazing, and I love Frankenstein for many reasons. But I would say um, Toni Morrison's probably the best. I've said this all the time to my students, like she is the best writer that we've had probably in the last 100 years, maybe ever. She's just does things with language, both the development of story, the development of character, but then also the depth of the poetry and the experimental qualities that she was working on. It just like she was doing all of it all the time. So she's great. I would have to say that the one book that I read probably a lot, both academically and because I loved it, is The English Patient when I was in high school and college. Michael Ondaatje's English Patient, which is has key differences from the film, which I did also like. But the book is just this fantastic puzzle box of a book that, I mean, it's poetry, and I did read once where he kind of wrote it out and then mixed it all together. Like he didn't write it in the way that we see it. He wrote it in patterns of or motifs and then mixed the motifs because the story is about memory being reclaimed. And so it works like little poems that are being pulled out, or vignettes that are being pulled out of this guy's memory. And I just love the way that all of that works. And I probably read it the most out of any novel that I haven't taught. Um, so I'd say he's probably, that book especially is one of the things that I've enjoyed most. But literary heroes, even just like right now, there are writers, poets especially, that I admire a lot and want to be writing more like. I think Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic is one of the best books I've read in a while. I just love what he did there. I love him. He's just, I don't know if you've listened to him in any, you should listen to his interview with Rachel Zucker
Okay.
on her podcast. And he's just a wonderful person. So I like when the writer is also a wonderful person, because you can kind of just see how all of that plays out and what they're writing. I also really admire what Diane Seuss does across her books. She's just she's prolific, but she's also eclectic. Like you get a book of sonnets that are a memoir, you get these really gritty poems, and then you get this like high art beauty of still life ekphrasis. So she's, I would say like in the ways that I write in similar like weird ranges. Like I'll have these very high art type writing about still life poems, like this poem "The Ray" that I wrote that got published in Barron last year is one of those. And then I'll write like a pop culture poem about David Attenborough narrating the lives of people, or understanding he's narrating the life of a parent, of a father figure, and then the poem goes into like a whole discussion about what it means to be a dad, both from being a son of a dad and being a dad myself. So I'll write in all different kinds of ways. So I really admire writers that are not just pigeonholing themselves into this one thing. I'm finding that is the way I read. I'll get obsessed with something and I'll read that for a long time. Like for 2 years, I read pretty much only nature nonfiction.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah, and
that's cool.
and then I'll switch off to like something else will catch my interest, and I'll read obsessively that way. And it's meandering, and it's now that I'm not taking courses, it's almost like I'm teaching myself.
Mm.
Instead of taking college courses, I'm creating them
Mm.
through my own reading. But I'm noticing that my writing works in the same way. Like I'll get really, I spent a year writing climate change poetry almost exclusively. With the here and there, I'd have like an observational poem that kind of was personal or just interesting to me, something jumped out. And then I switched to this Jewish ancestry. Like I found out that my family, I was always told as a kid that my family immigrated from Russia, but it was a catch-all. And I recently looked into it and found out that it was present-day Ukraine and Poland. And I was just kind of told in this general way that like, they escaped from pogroms. And so I kind of was just thinking about that and researching that a little bit. And then it turned into this chapbook that I just finished last month about a shtetl, trying to imagine, well, what would my ancestors be like before they left? Because even in America, the census information that I was able to find, like no one spoke English; it was all Yiddish, and it's interesting to think about, like, there's a whole culture there that existed in its own kind of way, and what was that like? And then it transplanted, at least my family transplanted, and then it petered off. Like, my great grandmother spoke it exclusively. My grandmother spoke it in English. My dad understood it, and then that it died, right? And so I only know the Yiddish that most people know from watching Mel Brooks or
Yeah.
have you, right? So it's like, so part of that process was like reclaiming, something that I was never going to have, and naturally, so trying to think of it through that. And now I'm just kind of figuring what's my next project. The Dunkin' Donuts poems aren't quite cohering as strongly. There's a couple of them, but I don't know. I gotta figure that one out.
Well, I enjoyed the Mary Oliver one and your description of the crullers and the wrinkles in the crullers. So just to give you a little insight, we work together, Marianne, Tiffany, and I, and we do Dunkin' Donut treats like almost all the time.
Are you in New England? Are you New England poets too?
No, Western New York,
Okay. Yeah.
but we love our Dunkin' here in
Yeah.
Western New York as well. Um, it has been such a pleasure. I could really just listen to you talk all evening. I'm not kidding. I'm just like,
Thank you.
yeah, this has been awesome. I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to picking up your book. I think that that's going to be very interesting. Again, and I want to make sure I get it right. Who will cradle your head? So 2023. Do you
Yep.
have any idea when in 2023 or?
I think February. I
Nice.
think so. I think the official timetable is going to be coming out sometime this week, but in the conversations I've had, I think February is where it's looking, unless there's some change.
Well, I've really enjoyed when going on your website and reading what you've written. I think it's fantastic. Because I
Thank you.
wanted to do, I was like, I'm just not going to come on and just talk. When I saw the Mary Oliver poem, I couldn't believe it. And I did see so is it Richard Attenborough, Sir Richard Attenborough,
Yeah.
narrated. I saw that series, so I'm going
Yeah.
back in and I'm gonna take a look because that's very funny to me. The
Yeah.
thought is funny. I don't know if it's a funny poem, but it was very
Yeah.
intriguing.
Yeah. I mean, some of them are serious, and some of them, are definitely meant to be a little more light and funny. So
Thank you so much, Jared. I really appreciate your time. And this
thank
will be
you.
up on a Word Wednesday in a couple of weeks. I'll let you know before we post.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
You too.
Night. It's night.
Yeah. Have a great evening, everyone.